Okay, great. What I'm going to talk about today is very much the politics of basic income. So actually the next talk as well. So in a way you can think of the topic today and the topic for next week as sort of politics of basic income, part 1, part 2. Okay? So for that reason, I've actually assigned 3 readings, but they cover the 2 weeks. Okay, so they're background readings, right? Okay, so they'll tell you something about the politics of basic income. And actually one of these readings, the one by myself, is actually the topic for next week. So that one is a bit more closely covered. What I'm going to be talking about today actually is something that I think is a very interesting angle, but that's very much not yet covered in the literature. So I'm actually writing a paper on it. So soon there will be a publication, but for now, we're still figuring it all out. Okay. The politics of basic income also ties in a way with what Lindsay Sturton was talking about last week. So that was very much about implementation, practical design and implementation. But one of the points that Lindsay tried to make is that these are not just technical choices, right? I mean, much of what Lindsay was talking about is very much about, the political choices when we think about designing a basic income and trying to avoid these policy fiascos and so on and so forth, okay? So in some sense, last week, today, and next week is all about the politics. Okay. So what I want to talk about today is what's in the title, Basic Income, a Policy in Search of a Constituency. So I'm going to talk about, actually, I should use the fancy one. I'm going to talk a bit about the difference between beneficiary and constituency. We always talk about who benefits from a basic income. And that, in a sense, that's all very interesting, but that's not necessarily enough. When we talk about the politics, we need to go a step further. So I'm going to explain that. I'm going to explain what a basic income constituency is, and I'm going to show some problems with it. So I'll first start with sort of a basic problem. How do we actually get a constituency going? And then I'm actually going to go to 5 different sets of problems. And each of these, in a way, they're not necessarily problems that means that basic income is off the table. They're really challenges, right? They're things that anyone who wants to defend the basic income, who really wants to get it on the agenda, I think should take it very seriously. One of the problems that we have when we talk about the politics of basic income is that people spend a lot of time doing the economics. We spend a lot of time doing micro simulations, thinking about the cost and so on and so forth. We spend a lot of time thinking about the philosophy. What are the many reasons of justice that we can attach a basic income to? And then suddenly when we talk about politics, in a way, we're being a little bit naive. We kind of sort of think if we have enough good reasons, surely everyone's going to sort of, basic income, great, let's go for it, okay? Or perhaps, we need to just convince people all the time. And that's part of it. But there are some other worries, some really structural worries, having to do with, genuine politics, i.e. who benefits, who loses, and so on and so forth. Okay? And that's very much what this topic is about. So, why should we worry about the constituency? So, just very, very basic. This, in a way, is the way I like to think about the politics of basic income. It's often said that basic income is a very simple idea. Give every citizen a non-conditional income, individually. No conditions, all fine, great. But the politics is very complicated. That's the starting point. The idea might be simple, but the politics is very complicated. Why? Because different aspects of basic income look like it's politics as usual, and different aspects of them look like it's totally different. It's a totally new, radical idea. Remember Lindsay Sturton last week ended with that same point, right? There's a big question about whether basic income is this new idea, totally new idea, or whether in some sense it's a modification of what we already know. And it's important because if it's really, really new, then we need to figure all this stuff out. And if it's a modification of what we have, then actually you know, in some sense, it also may have the trappings, it may have the problems that our current systems have, or at least some of them. Now, the advantage is that if it looks like a modification of what we have in place, we can actually take lessons, we can learn from things we know from other policies. And that's partly what I'm going to do today, actually. I'm going to try and make some analogies between some of the facts, some of the insights that we have from different areas of policy, and try to apply them to the basic income idea. And the key point is that constituency is a big political challenge, right? Constituency is about identifying a set of people, a group of people, who's really, really very supportive of basic income. Every policy you can imagine needs a constituency, because constituency is the group that pushes interest groups, for example. This is the group that pushes the politicians to adopt a scheme, to keep it in place, not to mess around with it, and so on and so forth. The moment you lose a constituency is the moment that your policy can disappear. Okay? So it's very, very important. So, starting point is the difference between being a beneficiary and being a constituent. So being a beneficiary is all about who benefits, right? So we have what, you know, in the basic income debate, we have what's often referred to as target populations, like who are the people who are supposed to benefit most from a basic income. Now, we've come across some of these already in some of the past lectures, right? And the same in the readings. So you can come up with a list, very straightforward. So basic income is supposed to be good for the poor, right? Well, that's very straightforward. You know, if you're poor, a guaranteed income is going to lift you, at least to some extent, out of poverty. It's supposed to be good for the unemployed, because one of the things it does is it actually gives you the very income you may have a problem with if you become unemployed. And it does this in a way that, you know, is less stigmatizing, more dignified, and so on and so forth. It's supposed to take care of the precariat. The precariat is this whole group of people today who are in very risky job prospects. These are people who work in part-time contracts, you know, jobs that are just a week, little sort of, you know, lots of insecurity, no benefits, no, you know, no fixed wages sometimes, and so on and so forth. So lots of insecurity. Basic income is good for this group because it generates security. Basic income is supposed to be good for care workers. It's supposed to be good for women. It's supposed to be good for the disabled. It's supposed to be good for the homeless. And you can start adding a list. Okay? You will find in the literature and in the discussions, different people focus on different groups. For example, in the United Kingdom, for example, there's a guy who has been promoting basic income a lot as part of a disability rights agenda. He basically says, look, disabled people need something like a basic income to guarantee their own independence. Okay? In places like Canada, for example, a lot of people focus on health as a main reason for basic income. So you get people like the Association for Public Health, the Association of Social Workers, the Canadian Medical Association. They're all pushing this agenda because they think it really helps those who are suffering from ill health. Okay? So, but all this is beneficiaries. It's a policy category. It basically just tells us, look, here's a group of people who are going to be better off when we implement the basic income. So far, so good. I mean, that's great. That's a very important first step. We want to really identify who benefits, right? But I want to focus on a political category, constituency. So the question we then ask, actually the two questions we ask, is who amongst these beneficiaries are really strong political supporters, right? Because you can be a beneficiary and nevertheless not be a political supporter. And from a political perspective, it's the political support that matters, not just who benefits, right? Very straightforward. We need pressure. We need political pressure, okay? And then the second question related, what are the political levers that turn beneficiary into constituents? So what I mean by that is, like, once we've identified amongst the beneficiaries who are the supporters and who are the potential supporters, What are the triggers? What are the mechanisms that we have to turn beneficiaries into political supporters or prevent political supporters from stopping their support? So those are the very important political questions. Okay? So what do I mean by constituency? So here are 4 criteria. Right? The first one is a constituent is someone who has a vested interest. And a vested interest is an objective benefit. Okay? So clearly, there's very little point in thinking or trying to identify people who politically support something without having a vested interest. Now, I have to say, not all basic income supporters are people who are benefiting. You know, there's a lot of people who think that basic income is good for other groups, but I have solidarity with these other groups, and so on and so forth. So that's fine. Nothing in what I'm saying here says that you cannot be a political supporter unless you have a benefit. But if we want to target this, if we want to think about political strategy, those supporters who are the most robust, the most, the most focused, the most willing and able, ideally, to put political pressure are the ones who are going to be benefiting. So, but you have to have an objective benefit. You have to have a vested interest, a very strong interest. Okay? I mean, one of the classic examples in policy is pensions. One of the reasons why it's so difficult for governments, I mean, they do manage, but with some difficulty, why it's so difficult for governments to fiddle with pensions is because we have a strong group of people with a vested interest. Pensioners are voters. They're very active. They're usually organized, right? And to make it even more complicated, every one of us usually becomes a pensioner, ideally, at some point in our life. So, so that's a big group. That's a big group with a vested interest, okay? Now, it's not enough to have an objective benefit. That interest also has to be recognized by the person. So there has to be an awareness and an acceptance that you benefit. Now, you might think, why should we care about that? Well, you'd be surprised how many policies there are where people are benefiting and they actually refuse to accept the benefit. And I think one of the best examples is when you look at the United States, healthcare reform. I think most of you have heard this, how tricky it's been to change healthcare system in the United States, despite the fact that a huge amount of people would clearly benefit from these changes. They nevertheless resist, okay? Another example is, for example, something like inheritance tax. Inheritance tax has been tried in different countries, and it's always a failure. And it's really strange because inheritance tax does not affect most people. It really only affects the very rich. But it's actually, pretty much middle class, poor people are very resistant to this. They think, I'm entitled to pass on whatever little money I have to my children. No one's denying this. I mean, this inheritance tax is not going to affect you. It's only going to affect the very rich. But nevertheless, we resist, okay? So this is a sense of people not being aware or not willing to accept that they could be a beneficiary of a policy, right? And if that happens, clearly it's going to be a problem. So step 1, we need an objective benefit. Step 2, we need a subjective benefit. We need people to recognize it's there. But that, again, is not enough. We need 2 more things. We need, first of all, a willingness for people to engage in political action. Now, we all know scenarios, plenty of scenarios, where people may have strong views about policy, about what governments are doing, but simply don't take the steps to engage in this, right? So whether it's protest or not going to protest, whether it's voting or not voting, whether it's, writing to your representatives, engaging in all sorts of ways in the political system, a lot of people just don't do this, okay? Well, why? Because, I mean, one of the main reasons is because it always takes a bit of effort, a little personal cost to engage in politics. I mean, if you want to go protest and it rains, then you have to be willing to spend a couple of hours in the rain. For many people say, well, I'm in principle in favor of political protest, but it's raining, therefore I'm not going. I'm sure all the other people will be fine, and my little contribution is not going to matter. But if everyone thinks that way, clearly we have a problem, right? So that's your typical collective action problem. And then there's a fourth point. You also actually have to have the political capacity for political action. So think about voting. Most of us have the right to vote, right? And I say most of us because pretty much in every society there's still some people excluded. But when it comes to things like offering funding, and we all know that in many ways, funding can contribute to policy development through politics, campaigning, funding, protesting, all these different activities. Not everyone has the same capacity. If you have a political system where money plays a big role, then obviously the rich are going to have much more capacity than the poor. If you have a system where protesting is a lot more costly, where it's harder to become involved in legitimate process, then that's going to be a problem as well, okay? So you put all these things together, you see that being a constituent is not an obvious thing, right? We need to identify groups that have an vested interest, recognize this as an interest, have a willingness to engage in political action, and have the capacity to engage in political action, right? So that's quite different from simply identifying who's benefiting from basic income. So here is one of the problems then, going to the basic income right away. So what I've said so far is just drawing a distinction between, the policy category, the political category. So here is the problem. Marginal winners, in some sense, don't really matter very much for policy. So what that means is that we need a robust basic income constituency. We need a group that's large enough, that's, sort of able enough, in some sense, to put pressure. So a sufficiently large group of real beneficiaries willing and able to expend political effort, right? If we don't have a sizable enough group, we're just fiddling at the margins, and marginal winners don't really change much in politics, okay? So the starting point for that is that not everyone who benefits is one of these constituents, right? Forms part of a basic, stable political constituency. So simply identifying beneficiaries doesn't give you the story. We need to really find a way to think about identifying constituencies. And then actually a very important distinction comes in place, namely those who are really winners, strong winners of a basic income system, versus those who basically are entitled to a basic income but nevertheless don't necessarily win. Okay? Keep in mind that when we have a basic income, in principle, every citizen is entitled to the grant, but that does not mean that every citizen is a winner in this system, okay? I'm going to explain this a bit more. So how do we build a basic income coalition? Or rather, what are the problems with building a basic income coalition? So this is the starting point. Everyone has universal access, but the question then is, does everyone really benefit? Now, the very obvious answer to that is no. Why no? Because obviously some people have to pay for it, right? Now we can have big discussions about different tax systems, but independent of whatever tax system you use, pretty much, with some exceptions, some people are going to pay and some people are become net beneficiaries, right? If it's based on income tax, if it's based on consumption tax, if it's based on ownership or wealth and so on and so forth. Some people are going to be net contributors, some people are going to be net beneficiaries. So obviously the level of basic income, how high the basic income is a very important factor. If we want to think about who are, how many people are net beneficiaries, how many people are net contributors, the first thing we need to think about is the level of basic income. I mean, if it's going to be 550 euros per month, that's a different size group than whether it's going to be 1,000 euros a month or more, obviously. Not only is a different size of group of beneficiaries, but also the amount to which these people are better off is going to be different. The lower the level of basic income, you might have people who are better off, but only very minimally so. And why is that a problem? Well, if you're only minimally benefiting, say imagine that under a basic income scheme, you're benefiting, 25 euros a month. Say that we have a scheme in place, 550, and there's a group of people who benefit. but really only at 25 euros a month or 50 euros a month, do we really think that people are going to be strongly politically active to defend that 25 euros a month? Right? Probably not. Okay, that's the logic. It's a very straightforward logic. Okay, we need to know the amount of people, the group, the size of the group who benefit, but we also need to know how much they benefit. Right? Two very different things. If the group's not small, not large enough, if the group is too small, or if the benefit is too small, in each case it becomes marginal. Right? It eats into the political support. And this, for example, is a problem with some of these partial basic income proposals. By definition, a partial basic income, a basic income that is lower than, say, the basic needs or something like that, by definition, it's going to have less of a constituency than, than if you have a full basic income that's at the level of poverty or more. Who knows? Okay. So here is another interesting point, and I'm going to put these two strands together in a bit. Think of a very different way in which we can pay for a basic income. Think of a very different way of funding, namely by abolishing some programs and putting the basic income in place. So the argument here is that basic income streamlines a number of different programs that we have in place, which on the one hand is really, really great because it means we have to basically spend less money, right? I mean, all these different programs already cost money. If they're being replaced, that means that money can be used to fund the basic income, which in many ways is great. And in a lot of actual proposals, you will always find the combination of replacing some programs with then some sense of how taxes will pay for the rest. Now, the point, of course, is that if we're using program replacements, then we have a slight problem because for many people, it may be that the extra benefit of a basic income might not be much more than the benefit they already had under an existing program, right? So imagine that you earn you have some form of social assistance or say disability benefit or something like that. And we're proposing to change it with a basic income. And perhaps that means you are a winner, but perhaps it also means that your winnings is going to be marginal. It's only going to be the extra 50 euros per month and so on and so forth. So again, in this case, we might have a problem. We might not actually have a constituency effect if the replacement means that people don't win, really. Okay? Now, I want to put two qualifications. First of all, the existing programs that we have, where you have a lot of different programs that apply to different people, they are problematic in the sense that some people fall through the cracks. So one of the things that a basic income does, it paves the cracks, so to speak, right? It puts a very solid floor and it makes sure that no one escapes, so to speak, no one falls through the floor. So in that sense, of course, you can imagine that a basic income will have some constituency effect. But the question is how large? And another important qualification, a very tricky one actually, I mean, people tend to focus on the monetary benefit. They tend to focus on how well off are you if we replace this with that. But of course, one of the key points of a basic income is that, you're no longer being controlled. You no longer have to go through all these procedures of filling out forms, justifying yourself to some social, to some caseworker and so on and so forth. So the whole interaction with the bureaucracy, which a lot of people have a problem with, under basic income, that is supposed to be gone. So that, of course, is another benefit. So there will be people who may be only winning marginally, so to speak, but nevertheless experience the difference, not in monetary terms, but in real terms, as very, very important. Okay? And a lot of people in the basic income movement, rightly, and in the literature, focus on that aspect, saying that basic income is just much, much better because the way it puts forward the program is just a lot easier, right? It's a lot more dignified, less stigma, and so on and so forth. So my point here is simply to say, well, we need to actually be able to think about this. We need to, in some sense, investigate empirically how many people become a constituency based on, for example, the fact that there's no stigma involved and so on, and how many people fail to become a constituency because they think in purely monetary terms and they say, well, at the end of the day, I'm not really winning that much. I can't be bothered. Okay? Those are two equally plausible scenarios, and we need to have proper studies to figure out what they do. Okay? I wanted to say something quickly about the social insurance thing, but I think for time reasons, I'm going to skip this. The argument here briefly is that you could also think about constituencies not just about benefiting now, but, you know, sort of security for possibly losing your job. And again, there's arguments in favor and there's arguments that say, well, we have to be careful how much of an effect we can expect there, but I'm going to leave this for now. I kind of want to put these two strings together. Remember, I was talking about the taxes, saying that, look, with taxes, we have some issues going on, right? So, and I was talking about replacing programs. So if you put these two together, so here is an interesting political paradox, what I think is a political paradox. Think about taxation-based funding. So the higher your rate of tax, the higher your basic income, you know? I mean, just forget about anything else, right? Forget, we're just talking about funding basic income here. Or to put it differently, the higher you want your basic income to be, the more tax you have to find, okay? Now, at some point, there's going to be a level of taxation that people are going to object to. So you create a counter-constituency, right? So you need to have a fine balance. And one of the things that the working group at Kela found, they did some surveys and they actually found that the moment, so what they asked is, you know, how many people are supporting basic income and so on and so forth. And if you only talk about how many people support basic income, if you ask citizens in Finland or elsewhere, are you in favor of basic income? You will find a lot of people being in favor. The moment you actually ask them, are you in favor for this level of basic income with this level of tax? Or are you in favor of that level of basic income with that level of tax? You suddenly see that, you know, people become a lot more cautious. So this is a real thing. You know, putting the tax in there is a real thing. It's a real consideration. Now, the obvious solution to this is to say, well, let's work more on the replacement of the programs because we then need less tax, right? That's what I was saying before. You know, if we can fund basic income partly through replacing programs, we have less of this tax objection going. Now, the problem then is the more we replace programs, the more programs we replace with a basic income, you know, the more we have a problem in the sense that a lot of the people who've been using these programs might not be really benefiting. So this is the second point that I was making earlier. So in some sense, it's a bit of a paradox. You know, the higher you put the taxes, the more you create a constituency, but the more you also create a counter-constituency against basic income. The more you use replacement programs, you're eating into the counter-constituency, which is good, but you're also eating into your regular constituency, right? I hope this is a bit clear. I know it's a weird way of thinking about it, but it's just linking two different arguments. And basically saying that, look, if we put these two together, we might have a problem. Now, how much of a problem is something that we need to empirically investigate? What I'm saying, I'm just putting these mechanisms on the table and say, look, guys, think politically, take this seriously, and don't just expect that, you know, we can just fund this and it's going to be fine. You know, no, there's real political consequences on each of these proposals. So that's just the baseline. Now let's just assume for the moment that we can somehow sort this out. We can find a way where, you know, we have a way of funding through a combination of these things, or perhaps another source that gets us some baseline of a constituency. So what I want to do basically in the next of the talk, I'm going to show you 5 problems, 5 reasons why either people don't accept basic income, or somehow in various ways it eats into this constituency building process. So remember, one of the things we need to do when we build a constituency, often a constituency is not a single group, right? I mean, imagine, you know, remember the target groups that we had before. We had care workers, we have the poor, we have the unemployed, we have the disabled. These are all different groups with different problems. Now, one argument that people in basic income movement put forward is basic income is good for each of these groups, so they'll all be supportive. Actually, I'm going to show you some arguments why that might not work. So we might not actually be able to get a constituency that's really working together in a clear sense. And that's a problem, again. So let's go through each of these. So the first problem is what I call here symbolic contamination, but it's something in the literature that's been called as such. So what is symbolic contamination? So symbolic contamination has a lot to do with how we frame basic income. It's about symbolism, right? So a policy, you can think of a policy as something that constitutes an objective benefit. But every policy is always framed in a particular way. It's very, very important. Lots of research showing that framing is a key issue in getting policy on the agenda. So one of the classic frames, one of the classic problematic frames for basic income is that of a free lunch, right? I thought it was really hilarious. Pertti and I were at Kela last week at the workshop, and we got a free lunch at a basic income conference. So, you know, of course we had to work for it after, so it wasn't really a free lunch, but I thought the idea was great. So, but when people think about a free lunch, this is always a problem, right? This always eats into this idea that some people deserve support and other people don't. And what happens if we give a basic income and people just sit, you know, Homer Simpson effect, and so on and so forth. So now I'm not going to go into the arguments about whether this is a problem as such. I mean, Simon Birnbaum, for example, talked about this, right? We can think about this in terms of philosophy. I'm interested in the politics of this. So the symbolic contamination is really, really interesting in the following sense. Imagine that you are a person who used to be hardworking, you know, as in the past has worked very hard, and through some sort of accident, for example, is unable to work. The basic income would really be a very, very good thing for you. But you're framing, or you're looking at basic income through the frame of the free rider. You do not want to be associated with the free riders. The free riders are a different type of people. They're not me, you know? Right? So you want to create that distance. So the problem with symbolic contamination is that, you know, in some sense, what could happen is that if something is framed in a bad way and it gets expanded universally to other groups, you know, the contamination gets expanded as well. The free riding frame gets expanded and people reject this in various ways, right? So we have at least three problems if we have this sort of moral contamination. First of all, there's actually people who refuse to take up benefits. Now, we have actually empirical evidence of this from another policy. In the United States in particular, all these policies that were targeted to, you know, single mothers, non-working single mothers, very, very stigmatizing policies. A lot of, like, welfare, you know, the actual welfare in the United States context. We know that a lot of people refuse to take it up. Even if it, you know, I mean, even if it would really allow them to, you know, eat and heat their house and so on and so forth, they refuse to take it up because of the stigma, right? They did not want to be associated. I am not a welfare queen and so on and so forth. I will not be on welfare. That's the last step. You know, you want to do anything to avoid that. Why? Because it's not just money, it's money that's stigmatized, right? So this effect potentially could become attached to basic income as well. If the basic income frame is being a free rider, then loads of people are going to reject this. Obviously, there's also going to be decreased political support across different groups and classes. So this idea that we're all kind of going to be working together as different potential beneficiaries, that's not going to happen, right? It eats into the different groups. You know, I mean, I'm a hard-working person. I don't want the sort of benefit that a homeless guy who sits in the street and uses drugs and drinks and all the bad stuff, you know? I mean, I'm not saying they do, I'm just exaggerating here, right? So I just don't want to be associated with that. So, you know, I really clearly I do not want any solidarity with that group, so to speak. We'll talk about solidarity in a minute. And the other problem, the final problem, is that the net beneficiaries, the people who are really benefiting from basic income, if they're framed that way, they are not really considered constituents because they're not taken very seriously by the political system, you know? I mean, why do you think it's so hard to lobby for prison reform? Unless it means putting more people in prison. That's always very easy, right? But prison reform in a more sensible way, namely, it's usually too costly, it doesn't really work very well in a lot of places, and so on and so forth, you know? Or drug reform, and so on and so forth. Why? Because these groups, you know, these are not groups that we want to associate with. You know, these are groups that have to be sanctioned. They're not groups whose interest we have to take seriously as a political class, and so on and so forth. So all these problems line up simply by the virtue of the fact that we have this symbolic contamination going on. Okay? So that's one big problem, you know. So one big problem, we think about basic income, we want to look at the constituency, but if framing comes into it, we may have a problem, a serious problem. So solidarity I mentioned before. So one of the arguments that people often put forward saying that, look, you know, basic income is brilliant because everyone gets it. It's universal. Therefore, no one can complain. We create solidarity amongst each other and so on and so forth. Basic income is like universal education, universal healthcare, and so on and so on. Well, we want to be a bit careful about that. So there's a line of research in social policy and especially in the history of social policy that strongly suggests that universal welfare states work because in some sense, you know, we obscure who contributes and who benefits, who is a net contributor, who's a net beneficiary. So the idea of a welfare state, one of the reasons why we have this solidarity amongst people, in some sense is because it could always be me. You know, at some point I may become at risk of, you know, becoming ill, therefore universal healthcare seems like a good idea, you know, and so on and so forth. Pensions is a great example because, you know, we all get old, we all need a pension at some point. So there's all these arguments that say, look, we're all in it together. Now, one of the problems with basic income is that we seem to have this very clear, transparent indication that, you know, some people are contributors and some people are beneficiaries, right? Okay? And transparency is often put forward as a virtue in policy. It's great if we can always see what's happening in clear sense. But when it comes to welfare research, welfare state research rather, transparency may well be a problem. We need a little bit of muddling the waters so that we can actually maintain this solidarity. The more transparent, the more it becomes clear that I'm a net beneficiary and you're a net contributor. That means, you know, in some sense, the more it becomes clear that I'm just a different type of person than you, right? And at the next stage basically is to say, well, you know, if you're a different type of person than me, perhaps this whole solidarity thing should be weakened and so on and so forth. And this is when you get social divisions, right? So the argument that basic income is great because it's universal, maybe not. Again, this is sort of a point that has to be empirically tested. So I'm not saying that this will happen. What I'm saying is there's evidence from other areas to suggest that we need to think about this a bit more deeper. We need to check it. We can't just rely on it, that this is nevertheless going to happen. And we should also see that the smaller, this is the last point on the slide here, the smaller the group of net beneficiaries. I mean, keep in mind again what I said before, the level of basic income is very important. If we have a low level of basic income, we have smaller group of net beneficiaries. Now, the smaller the group, the easier it is to kind of put them aside, to say, look, you know, we're all in it together, apart from that little group. You know, that little group is different. You know, they shouldn't really, they don't deserve our solidarity, and so on and so forth. So even within universalism, we can have reduced solidarity, right? It's a phenomenon that several people right now are actually researching in various areas, okay? Because we don't just see it in income maintenance, we see it in healthcare reform, education, and so on and so forth, right? But it has a major implication, right? Because the moment we can shove these people aside, then at that moment it becomes very, very easy in a sense for political groups to say, well, let's just get rid of this basic income thing. So this is a problem for stability of basic income over time. So a third argument, competing constituencies. So again, the argument is that we're all in it together. So all these different groups that potentially benefit from a basic income, they mutually support each other. They mutually support the policy. And all is great in the world. All will be well. And you know, we all live long and happy and have many children and so on and so forth. You know, fairy tale politics. Unfortunately, not quite. So here is an argument that shows that this could be a problem. So the point I want to make here is that actually these constituencies could compete against each other. Their interests may not be aligned all the time. And it may be a problem getting the basic income off the ground, getting it started, or it may become a problem even expanding it in a fully universal way or keeping it on the books, so a stability problem. So here is one argument that we often find in terms of how to implement the basic income. So the suggestion is we should do this in a sequential way, in a piecemeal, gradual way. How do we do this? Well, we start by identifying the least controversial group. We give them a basic income. We move to the next uncontroversial group. We give them a basic income, and so on and so forth, until you get to the more controversial groups. So practically, people have proposed, let's start with a basic pension. Pensioners, everyone likes pensioners. Pensioners like themselves. And, you know, given that we'll become pensioners, we usually like pensioners as well. As a category, this is a very uncontroversial, very, you know, for politicians, it's good. The golden rule is give something to the pensioners and, you know, you're okay in the elections, pretty much, more or less. So pensioners, we give them a basic pension, great. And then we move to children. Everyone likes children, right? We all have them. Many of us know people with children and so on. Who would possibly object to children? So we'll give a child benefit, a basic income for children. And then we identify some other groups. Students, you know, great. Students is good for society and so on and so forth. We should support people, students, okay. Disabled people, they're, you know, they're very deserving. They're not to blame. They're unfortunate what's happened to them, but they need our support. And you can go on and on and on, right? You identify a bunch of groups. And at the end, you have this, the rest group of the working age adults. And the working age adults are tricky because, you know, I mean, we're supposed to work. So if we then have a basic income and become free riders, that's where the tricky bit comes in, right? But you can see how it's supposed to work. You start with the easy group. You have established the basic income. You expand it to the next, expand it to the next. And, you know, it might take you 5 or 10 years. But at the end of these 5 or 10 years, we have a basic income. And, you know, it's a very easy political way to roll it out. I mean, it is if it would work. And so here's a couple of problems. Why do we really think that because one constituency has received the basic income that they actually would support expanding it to the next one? Why do you think the pensioners would be so keen to say, well, I've got my basic income, of course, let's pass it on to other people. Maybe they would be happy to do it for the children because, you know, the children being their grandchildren. But, you know, why would they keep expanding it? Why would pensioners support, you know, basic income for students and so on and so forth, right? So I think there's at least a few reasons to think that this might be a problem. So first of all, it has to do with this symbolic contamination thing again. You know, the framing might start eating into here. The pensioners basically say, look, I deserve a basic income. It's unconditional, it's individual, but I deserve it because I've worked hard my whole life. These people haven't. Right? So framing can play a big part. And then there's the very straightforward economic interest competition. You know, pensioners may think, and probably have good reason to think, that, look, if we expand the basic income, it means we may need more taxes, which means some of my other pension income can be taxed to pay for the basic income of other people. Or alternatively, we expand the basic income, but we lower the level. And then I get less as a pensioner. So, you know, if I'm a self-interest pensioner, which many I imagine are, you know, then I'm just making the calculation and I'm saying, well, perhaps, you know, I can see this solidarity argument, but really I'm just better off if we keep a basic pension and we leave it at that. Or, you know, maybe put the children in there, but that's it. We're not going to go much further, okay? So if I'm right with that, then constituencies can compete, and we need to be very careful. Okay, so this idea that we can build a very strong, robust social base, political base, out of very different groups in society who all could potentially benefit. We need to be careful about this, you know. Again, this is, you know, as I said before, and I will say a few more times, this is a mechanism. We have some evidence that this happens in various areas. We don't have any evidence whether this will happen in basic income because we don't know what will happen with basic income. But you know, but it's something that we need to check and be aware of it carefully. Okay? I have two more of these. So weak political responsiveness. So remember, I said that one of the whole point of a constituency is that you also have to have the capacity to get involved in politics. Now, capacity is partly something that you have as a citizen, but it also partly depends on how responsive the political elites are, right? So, I mean, one of the reasons why rich people have so much power is because politicians are very responsive when it gets to getting money, okay? I mean, so there's a relationship going on here, right? One reason why strongly organized voting blocks, like pensioners, have so much power is because politicians know that if we can target our strategies, our election strategy, to that particular block, we can guarantee that vote in some way, okay? So political responsiveness is very important. So the question then is, what do we think in terms of basic income beneficiaries? How politically responsive are they? So here again, there's a couple of problems. The first one is the size. If net beneficiaries, again, are a small group, then this is a problem, because in politics, numbers often matter. It's not the only thing that matters, but you know, think about elections, think about social protest, mobilizing people on the street. It matters whether there's 500 people protesting or 5,000 or 50,000, right? So numbers is an issue. Being organized probably is even more of a problem, right? Because having the numbers is great, but the best thing you can have as a political resource is a very organized group. Because an organized group gets a lot done, right? They campaign, they're very directed, they campaign, they bother politicians all the time, they have strategies, they get into the news, and so on and so forth, right? This is why politicians are really afraid, even of small but very well organized groups, right? Special interest groups. That's why they're called that way. Now, one of the biggest problems with basic income is if basic income is this diffuse social group of beneficiaries, it's not clear that they are as organized, right? So here is a little illustration. It's a while now, but sort of around the 80s, we sort of had a debate about basic income and trade unions. And some people were putting forward the idea that basic income is the trade union for the unemployed. And that never made any sense to me, because the point is precisely trade unions are very highly structured and organized organizations, right? If you have a trade union of students or of, you know, professors or any job or any job group that you want, they're very close, they're very organized, and so on and so forth. The unemployed are, you know, they're not organized. They're very, very different type of people, right? They share the fact that they're unemployed, but apart from that, you know, you can have an unemployed lecturer or an unemployed metal worker or an unemployed bus driver, unemployed banker, God, who knows, right? These are very, very different people. It's not that easy to organize them in the same way. So organization matters. And then there's another point, which is if a basic income constituency is also made up out of groups that are framed in a bad way. So this is the framing thing popping in again. It pops in all the time, right? They're framed as sort of deviant, somehow different from the rest of us. Then this is going to have an impact on political responsiveness, because politicians are very, very happily ignoring groups like the homeless, like drug addicts. I mean, try and like immigrants. You know, one of the groups I was just meeting with is going to do a little project on immigration and basic income. Well, immigrants is, try and defend the rights and the interests of immigrants and refugees. And, I mean, politicians kind of are very interested now because it's a problem. But, it's a problem for us. It's not a problem for the immigrants, so to speak, right? Okay? So these are groups that are framed in the wrong way. And to the extent that basic income, if basic income is attached to these groups as the main beneficiaries, then we have a problem of political responsiveness, right? So the effect of that could be something that we'll discuss next week, which is the idea that a lot of political support could be cheap support. It's support that doesn't really help us. It's politicians saying, yeah, basic income, good idea. But that's it. They're not willing to push it necessarily, and so on and so forth. But that's for next week, right? Next week we'll talk about political strategies and, dealing with politicians in that sense, or with political groups. And then I have a final point. In the basic income arguments, we could actually be ignoring some important constituencies. So this is the one I'm referring to here, tags into the previous lecture by Lindsay Sturton. When we think about basic income, we often think about it as being opposed to administration, being opposed to bureaucracy. People often literally say one of the great advantages of basic income is we can get rid of the bureaucrats. Now, from a constituency point, that's a problem. Because, you're really making an enemy of a group of people who have a strong vested interest in the system being the way it is. And the more you make them an enemy, the more they have an interest in the system being the way it is. I mean, if you're telling bureaucrats and saying that, look, you should be supportive of basic income, by the way, you're going to lose your job. But nevertheless, isn't it a good idea? I mean, it's not, it's not very convincing, right? Now, historically, bureaucracies and, and administrative workers and so on, they were a genuine constituency. I mean, these are people who systematically vote in favor of, state budgets, right? So keep in mind that one of the first steps of policy is we need to have a budget devoted to putting a policy in place. A lot of people also always want to vote less taxes, less budget, less money for the state to play with. Well, administrative workers, bureaucracies, by virtue of what they do and who they are, they will vote disproportionately in favor of keeping budgets in place. So that's good. We should get these people on board. Now, secondly, politicians, when they roll out policy, they always have to work with bureaucracies. So it's a myth to think that politicians just decide and bureaucrats are these little machines that just implement. It's not like that, right? There's a lot of complications in terms of getting policy implemented in the right way, and a lot of initiative, a lot of effort, a lot of skills, a lot of know-how is at the level of the bureaucracy. And this is why historically bureaucrats were always able to prevent politicians from dismantling part of the welfare state or the pension system and so on, right? Or the health system, you name it. Now, I mean, so they have two powers. They have the organizational power, they have the voting power. And here we are trying to make enemies out of these people instead of trying to treat them as constituencies of some sort. If we can find a way, so to speak, to make basic income work in line with what, administrative caseworkers and so on are thinking, then we can actually use them as a constituency in our favor. So we shouldn't ignore them, and we definitely shouldn't work against them. We shouldn't alienate them. So I think actually Pertti can say a lot more about this, but one of the projects as part of the basic income experiment is precisely to look at what some of these workers are thinking in terms of, what happens when a basic income is being implemented in Finland and so on and so forth. So there's quite an awareness that this is an issue, right? Okay, so I think drawing all these things together, I mean, this has been a lot of sort of different ideas floating around, but what underlies them in each case is that I've tried to find mechanisms from different policy areas that in some sense tell us, look, we need to be careful. We need to be careful about thinking about basic income in a political way. You know, I mean, nothing what I've said is to say that basic income is impossible or politically inefficient and so on. You know, nothing at all. But to be smart at the politics of basic income, we need to realize these hurdles, and we need to first do some research, try and figure out how much of a problem it is in a particular country, in Finland, elsewhere. And then we can think about political strategies to overcome them. So one of the key points is, and so two key points basically in this conclusion I just want to point out. Having good reasons for basic income is not enough. It's a starting point. It's an obvious starting point, and we need having good reasons. But we need to build on those. We need to have the political levers to put, you know, a constituency in place. And an enacting coalition, which is going to be the topic for next week. And then when we focus on building such a robust basic income constituency, we need to be very aware of the fact that this is going to require political effort and political strategy. This is not something that's just going to happen. Politics is not just stuff that's out there. You know, it's not like a river that just flows, right? Well, a bit of it might be, but effectively, politics is all about pressure that we put on the system or fail to put on the system. And, you know, and in some sense, this is the river analogy again. I mean, the river flows because we have pressure of the water going, and we have, you know, the very river beds themselves will give the direction, right? Okay. And in some sense, politics is the same thing. I mean, we need a lot of pressure for certain decisions to flow, and we need to find ways to direct it in a particular way. That's what constituencies do in a democratic system, right? These are the powerful interests that will push basic income policy on the agenda or not, or keep it on the agenda or not, okay? And a lot of what I said today was just about, one, thinking about constituencies rather than beneficiaries, but then also a whole list of complications that we need to be very aware of once we start thinking down that road. Okay, that's it for today.